Brooke asked me, I think she called me a wimp. I think that was the word. Well, I may be a little crazy, but I'm not stupid. It's 0 degrees outside, so. All right, we are in Exodus chapter 13, and we're going to try to cover chapters 13 and 14 tonight. The Exodus really begins in earnest now in these two chapters. Of course, chapter 12, we had the 10th and final plague, and Israel is released. As you start off in chapter 13, you've got these first two verses here about the firstborn. Sanctify unto me all the firstborn, whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both man and of beast, it is mine. Now this was specified for the males, but they've been released from bondage, and what was, well, I guess I just told you, that final plague in Egypt was the death of the firstborn, wasn't it? So this is seemingly rather symbolic of that. Now the firstborn are dedicated to God, of both man and beast. And all the firstborn of Egypt, they died. I tell you what, who wants to do some reading for me real quick? 2 verses. You get Numbers 3:13, please. 8:17. Numbers 8:17. Just read them when you get there. This consecration, or this setting apart of the firstborn, obviously, is connected with the death of the firstborn, but also with the Passover. And that was discussed at length in chapter 12, but it's going to be further discussed. Read when you got them.
Numbers 8:17, for all the firstborn among the children of Israel were mine, both man and beast. On the day that I struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I sanctified them to myself. I have taken the Levites instead of all the firstborn of the children of Israel.
So in time it's going to change. This is the initial coming out of Egypt. It was all the firstborn, but then you have, of course, the priestly tribe that's consecrated for the service. All right? 3:13. Oh, Numbers 3:13. Okay, so there you go. You have this, and you see this throughout the Old Testament, this reference to the firstborn. You read about the first fruits, and in terms of sacrifice, it's like, well, I guess more so when you speak of the first fruits and sacrifice, it's the very best. It's what you would call the cream of the crop. They offer their best to God, the very first of it, all right? So you have that established here, and then verses 3 through 10, I guess you might call it a reiteration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, also known as the Passover. This is a memorial because of the passing over of the homes, houses, whatever, dwelling places with the blood painted on the doorposts. No leaven in the house. It's to be kept for 7 days. It's to be kept on a yearly basis. The further you go into Exodus, and of course then you get into Leviticus, it's like progressively we learn more and more about these feasts and what's done. But you keep it for 7 days, and then on the 8th day there was a sacrifice, but we'll learn about all that in time. Not a whole lot to add to verses 3 to 10 there, or to comment on, because again, we read it really in chapter 12. But you do notice there in verse 5, it shall be when the Lord shall bring thee into the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. You're going to keep it, this service in this month. So, a new beginning, and this new feast, the consecration of the firstborn. You get down to verse 11, verses 11 to 16. We jump back on the topic of the firstborn. And let's see, verse 11. It shall be when the Lord shall bring thee into the land of the Canaanites, as he sware unto thee and to thy fathers, and shall give it to thee, that thou shalt set apart unto the Lord all that openeth the matrix, the womb, and every firstling that cometh of a beast which thou hast, the males shall be the Lord's. And he just goes into further detail there. So, limited obviously to males and male animals. So what they were told to do, the firstborn, they are dedicated to God. But then as you keep reading the text, they were told to redeem it. What does it mean to redeem something? Yeah, purchase it or buy it. So they give it to God, and then your first blank here, as an indication of their devotion to God, they would redeem it. They'd buy it back from God. It's dedicated to Him, then they could redeem it. I tried to think of questions that you might ask in regard to that. I don't know, so just don't ask any questions about that. But it's dedicated to God, and again, I think it's emblematic of their devotion to God that they would redeem it. I really don't know. I don't know how they view it these days. I do know, and I guess this would be more in connection with the promised land and the inheritance and stuff, but when the temple was destroyed in AD 70 in Jerusalem by the Romans, everything was destroyed, the records, everything. And so you lose track then of, I guess what you might say, your ancestry and your inheritance and all of that stuff. AD 70, the events that surround that, of course, Jesus talks about it. All three gospel, John doesn't, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the prophecy of Jesus in regard to the destruction of Jerusalem. I think there are indications of it throughout other passages in the New Testament. That is an extremely significant event, and particularly in connection with things like this, in relation to Judaism. We know, Scripture teaches that Christ did away with the law through the body of His flesh, right? Nailed it to the cross. It's taken out of the way. So when that happened, there are not two laws running concurrently, all right? Running at the same time. God doesn't have the old covenant running and then the new covenant running when Jesus died. However, just because He died on the cross doesn't mean that all those Jews immediately forsook Judaism and started obeying the gospel. I mean, we know that from the book of Acts, don't we? And you look at the book of Hebrews, and it even talks about, in the present tense, I'm trying to think of the verse. There's one verse in particular. Anyway, it talks about the sacrifices that are being offered at the altar. And the book of Hebrews is written in the late 60s. And so 35 years after the death of Christ, the Jews are still keeping the services of the temple. And that was one of the main problems, as you know, in the first century church, is they're trying to bring that, they're trying to mold that together with Christianity. And hence you have chapters like Acts 15, what we call the Jerusalem Conference. Okay, so here's a question that somebody asked. Why were they to break the donkey's neck if it was not redeemed? I don't know. There are some things that we're told that I don't know. Jeff, do you know? Anybody else know? Anyway. Any questions or comments on any of that before we move on here? Again, all of this is memorial. After the redemption of those firstborn. And the stated purpose then is, beginning in verse 14, it shall be when thy son asketh. It's like to perpetuate everything that has happened. This is the beginning of a new nation. This is God continuing to fulfill the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When they came out of Egypt, this is the beginning of months, right? Isn't that what God said? This is a whole new year, this day. So, it's to perpetuate these accounts to the future generations. Verses 17 to 22, the journey begins. The shortest route, okay, if you're looking, and I was going to put a map up there, but I didn't. I had one up there last week. But the shortest route would have been to leave where they were and go north, kind of bordering the Mediterranean Sea. And that's your next blank, towards Philistia. But what was God's reasoning in not leading them in that direction here? Anybody read ahead? Why did He not send them that way? Yeah. There are several times they want to turn around anyway, right? Well, if you approach an inhabited land with people like the Philistines, that's not going to go well. And you think of the 600,000 males, that doesn't include women and children, that were wandering through the wilderness. You don't fight with that kind of a caravan going through the wilderness, and so takes them south down towards the Red Sea. The bones of Joseph are taken. This goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 50. Joseph, I tell you what, I'm going to turn over there real quick and just look at that. The last couple of verses of the book of Genesis, starting in verse 24. Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you. Carry my bones up with you. Don't leave me here. So he died being 110 years old. And you see that, you see a lot of oaths and promises in connection with the nation of Israel just like that. And even when you get to Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, and Peter's preaching about the resurrection, whose bones does he mention there? You remember? David. Let me talk to you about the patriarch. David's bones are here with us. He's not the one that was raised from the dead. So it's just kind of interesting to note those, like I said, oaths and covenants that are made in regard to them leaving Egypt and going to the promised land. They're led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And God stays with them. And it's amazing because right when we get in here to chapter 14, okay, so they've just left. And I think I can understand it a bit because of their immediate circumstance, why they complain. But the first complaint is coming up in the very next chapter. But God never leaves them, does He? Can you think of a passage, so you've got the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. Do you remember Bible passages that talk about what did God do for them throughout the wilderness? How did He feed them? Manna, quail from heaven, miraculous sources of water. Their clothes didn't wear out. Their shoes didn't wear out. And we're talking 40 years. I go through a pair of tennis shoes about every 6 months. 40 years. And God constantly provides for them, even though they're constantly complaining and saying, at least we had food back in Egypt. We might have died, but we wouldn't have died hungry. It's just amazing to watch what's getting ready to happen. Let's turn over to Joshua chapter 5 real quick. And there's a reason I was saying all of that. Somebody read for us that passage. Joshua 5, verses 10 through 12. This is right before they destroy Jericho. They've crossed the Jordan River. And notice a change here. There's this principle, I think, in Scripture, and I think that this just is one illustration of that God will not do for man what man can do for himself. Now again, 40 years, well over 1 million people, they're going to need help. They're going to need provision. They're going to need protection from, and we'll see as we go, from various enemies. But they get to the promised land, and you notice there, by the way, they kept the Passover, didn't they? Just like they were supposed to do. But now they start eating the produce of the land, and the manna ceased. They're home, in a sense. They've still got to conquer the land, but it's like, I think that principle, we can see it in other places in Scripture. God will not do for you what you can do for yourself, and what you should do for yourself. What is it? 1 Timothy 5 or 1 Thessalonians 5:8? If a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. He expects us to take responsibility, providing for ourselves, and Old Testament and New Testament. But even, okay, so think about that. Even in the Old Testament, the Israelites themselves were to make provisions for people in need, weren't they? You remember how that was to be, how they were to do that? Provisions for the poor? Yeah. Don't clean it out. And when you go to your vineyards, don't go over it twice. Pick through it once and leave the rest for those who are in need. So you do have this idea of a benevolent God caring for those who, let's say, are at a disadvantage, lacking things that, how would you say it, the more well-off don't lack. So it's just interesting to watch that throughout your Old Testament. Any questions or comments on chapter 13 here? Wanting to go back to the one who abused them? Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk. We're going to talk about that here in chapter 14 because it does kind of come out in the text that it's like, what else do we do? Let's go back to the worst place possible. And see, that's another thing too about their complaints and not just about God and about their scenario in the wilderness, but their complaints about Moses' leadership. It's one guy. It's just, sure. Sure, we can be, well, don't be murmurers and complainers, Philippians 2 says. Sure, their faith did waver a lot. And you think about it too. So, okay, the 10 plagues. And you see this, what was it, beginning in the 4th plague, was it? That God says, I'll make a difference between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Well, we look at it typically from the Egyptian perspective. Well, think if you're in the Israelites' camp. And you see all of this stuff just like there's a distinctive line of that plague stopping right here. And we're perfectly fine. You have all of that happening. And then you have all of the provision that God makes for them in the wilderness, but they still complain. It's still not good enough. And like I said, I think with this first one here in chapter 14, I could see that one more, but it's like it gets worse and worse. All right, chapter 14, verses 1 to 9, Israel is warned and Pharaoh pursues. They're warned that he's going to harden his heart again. And well, and the way it's said here in verse 4, and we've had this discussion, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, okay? And he's going to pursue them. Well, then you start reading in verse 5, and notice how that was done. I will harden his heart. Now, it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and of his servants was turned against the people. I was reading one commentary the other day, and it was saying like, he had granted them permission to go, hadn't he? And one of the last arrangements was, go a short ways, maybe 3 days' journey into the wilderness. Well, it's like here, Pharaoh's told, no, they're gone. They didn't just go a little bit to sacrifice, they're gone. And so now you have this, again, hardening of his heart. He made ready his chariot, took his people with him, 600 chosen. So these are the best warriors that he can muster, I guess you would say, to bring the people back. And the Lord, verse 8, hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued after the children of Israel. So, God would use the circumstances of their journey as a way to harden Pharaoh's heart, and that's precisely what we see happening. And it's nothing new, obviously, with Pharaoh, as much as we've read that throughout the plagues. Verses 10 to 18, Israel's first complaint. And so here, Joe, kind of what you were talking about, 2 blanks here. Death in freedom is better than life in captivity. But the Israelites kind of like you said, they've been there for 400 years. What else did they know but captivity? And again, you'll see as you progress through Numbers, through Exodus too, but the book of Numbers, or at least we had food in Egypt. They may have killed us, but we'd have full stomachs. So, let's see. They've been slaves for so long, they did not understand that death in freedom is better than life in captivity or slavery, however you want to say that. Let's go to Psalm 106 real quick. One of the interesting things about the Psalms is that there are quite a few what you would call historic psalms. They are accounts of historical events. And this is one of those, Psalm 106. If somebody would, please, read 7 through 12. Psalm 106, 7 through 12. Okay, hold on a second right there. Did you notice that? All the wonders that God did, all of that, but they rebelled at the Red Sea. That's where we are in Exodus chapter 14. And like I said, I can understand, from a human perspective, I can understand what they're getting ready to complain about. They're surrounded. One side, they've got the sea, and then you've got the best warriors from Egypt coming in chariots. I might complain about that too. All right, go ahead. Okay, they sang His praise. That's Exodus chapter 15. Exodus 15 is called the Song of Moses and Miriam. Look at verse 13. They soon forgot His works. Yeah, and that again, that's the rest of the book of Exodus. Numbers. I mean, it's just time and time again. But I suppose when you've been in a certain scenario for so long, and according to what they say, they did have plenty of food. But they had harsh taskmasters. You go back to Exodus chapter 1, and they made them serve, the King James says, with rigor. Would you rather be, that's quite a scenario. Would you rather be free and feel like you're going to starve to death or be killed? Or would you rather be serving under somebody and have plenty to eat? And know that tomorrow I will have food. I got to work really hard for it, but you know what? I'll be able to eat. Yeah, they had no clue what freedom was. Yeah. Yes. Fear of the unknown. That's a good point. So here's their first complaint. Beginning in verse 10. Verse 11. They said unto, so you got the sea on one side, here come the Egyptians. They said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, you've taken us to let us die out here? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? It's like they're really giving it to Moses. You should have listened to us. For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. So think the passage that Emily just read. I forget what exact verse it was, but it says He delivered them for His name's sake. He had made a promise that these people, again, going all the way back to Abraham, that they were going to, ultimately, of course, inherit that land, but all the way back to Genesis 15, God told them, your people are going to be slaves in a land for 400 years, and then I'll bring them out. He saved them for His name's sake. So think about, remember when Moses goes up in the mountain, Aaron builds the golden calf from everybody's jewelry. Aaron says, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. He'll lead us through the wilderness. And God tells Moses, I'm going to wipe everybody out. But Moses appeals to the name of God. If you do that, all of our enemies are going to say this and this and this about you. You're going to give our enemies a chance to blaspheme your name. And so I think that's interesting in Psalm 106. He delivered them from the Egyptians for His name's sake. It proved Him to be who He was saying He was. The God, okay, Jehovah. All right? Well, yeah, and here's somebody comments. With all that God had done for them, it seems they would have trusted God to deliver them to the promised land. And you know, I try to realize too, it's easy for us sitting in this building right now to say, oh, I can't believe they do that. Yeah. Well, you're not out there with them. You don't see these warriors coming in chariots and a big sea out in front of you. We don't know what we would have done, but they rebelled. That's what Psalm 106 says as well. They rebelled against God. No. We've never seen anything like that. So, yeah, no question. Have any of you ever heard of the theory in terms of their crossing here, the Reed Sea? Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay. There are some who believe that there was a shallow, marshy part at the very northern tip. So if you've got I guess I should have put the map up there. If you've got your Bible maps, look back at, you should have one that has the wilderness wandering or something like that. Mine's called the route of the Exodus. So instead of going up to Philistia, which is an inhabited land with warriors, Philistines are constant enemies of God's people, He takes them through the wilderness of Sinai. Okay? They leave Ramses, they go to Succoth, and they go down south. And the Red Sea, the split kind of looks like rabbit ears, doesn't it? And the part, seemingly, we're never told the specifics in the text, but it seems that they crossed somewhere on the Gulf of Suez, that left ear, if you will, of the split Red Sea there. Some people have tried to, I guess you would say, discredit the miraculous here by saying, well, there was a small tributary. It wasn't the actual Red Sea. It was a reedy, marshy area that was fairly shallow, and that's where they crossed. So just listen to that and tell me some of the problems you hear knowing what actually happened according to the biblical text. What are some contradictions between that theory and what we read happens? Yeah, how many armies drowned in a shallow marsh that you can just walk through? Not too many. What else? They walk through on dry ground. Yeah. And something else that you will see, look back at Exodus chapter 14. Look at verse 22 and verse 29. There's one phrase that describes what happens when the waters split. How does it describe the waters in verses 22 and 29? The waters become a wall. Somebody turn over to 1 Corinthians 10 and read the first two verses there, please. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2. So this idea of the Reed Sea, it falls apart under scrutiny. But, that's what people try to do to get rid of the miraculous, skeptics, things like that. 1 Corinthians 10, 1 and 2, somebody. Okay, under the cloud, through the sea. Go ahead. What does the word baptized mean? I mean, the definition, what is it? Immersed. How could you be immersed in a shallow, marshy area that you can just walk across? You can't drown in it. I mean, I suppose you could, but we're talking 600 chariots. Anyway, they were baptized unto Moses. into Moses' leadership is the idea there. When they crossed that Red Sea, they were baptized unto Moses. Clouds above them, and the waters congealed. One of the Hebrew words that's used describing these events says that the waters were congealed around them. Has anybody watched the Ten Commandments since the last time I asked that question? Yeah, like Jell-O. I don't know. If you haven't seen that movie, you might see it just for the entertainment value. Any questions or comments on any of this? Let's see. Oh, so one thing I looked at today, I hadn't looked at it before today, but GBN, Don Blackwell talked about this. GBN has those commentaries on their website, and the author, Bob Winton, actually has a page in his commentary on that reed sea theory. It's kind of an interesting read, so you might check that out if you want to. All right, so their first complaint, you brought us here to die. Verses 19 and 20, God makes provisions for the approaching enemy. The angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them. So obviously leading them from a forward position during the day and night, but when they're surrounded by the Egyptians, comes around the backside and is a wall, in essence, between them and the Egyptians. And it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and it was a cloud and darkness to the Egyptians, but it gave light by night to Israel, so that the one came not near the other all the night. Again, there is another miraculous intervention besides all the ones we've talked about. God is constantly providing for and protecting these people. Moses stretched out his hand to cover his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea, what Kevin says, dry land, and the waters were divided. There's no indication in the text of a shallow marsh. I mean, the description of what's going on here is obviously God's intervening on their behalf. The children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground. There it is again. And the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Yeah, somebody says, you don't cover up chariots, horses, and men in a shallow marsh. That's exactly right. So, there is, and you have to be careful with this. Somebody just asked on the live stream, do you know if any parts of the chariots of bone or bones have been found in the Red Sea? There was this thing floating around on the internet, and of course you know if that's what's happening, it's got to be true, of supposed remnants of chariots and bones and all of this. That is not true. Nothing like that has been found. They don't know where the Red Sea was crossed precisely. Or again, we refer to it probably as the Gulf of Suez, I guess. We don't know. So no, nothing like that has been found. 21 to 31, Israel crosses and Egypt drowns. Now they're pursuing them. They get in, and God permits this. The Egyptians make it into the midst of the sea. But you start reading in verse 25, He took off their chariot wheels that they drave them heavily. In other words, a chariot without wheels isn't too good. It just falls apart. Yeah. That's true, yeah. 600 chariots. And how wide were they going, And how long? Yeah, that would be quite a sight. And again, I can understand their complaint. I think. The fear that they would have, I think would be natural. Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. Well, what do you think the 10 plagues were all about? Again, it just shows the condition of Pharaoh's heart. He's willing to kill the very best people that he's got, the most well-trained and able fighters that he's got, to go get these people. Talk about a hard heart. Well, Moses stretches out his hands. The water comes again on the Egyptians, chariots, horsemen, verse 26. When the morning appeared, the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered all of that. Do you remember, I think, back in chapter 10? Chapters 10 and 11, one of the last things that Pharaoh said, next time you see me, something along those lines, or you won't see me again, or next time you see me, you're going to die, something like that. But, well, Here we are. Verse 30, thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw that great work. And again, referring back to what Emily read in Psalm 106, this is just the beginning of God's miraculous provision, His intervention, as we say sometimes, that should have been, I mean, it's like, how much evidence do you need? And they still were not faithful to God. And the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and His servant Moses. That doesn't last long, though. It doesn't last long at all, in fact. Any questions or comments on any of this? It's hard to say. I mean, yeah. Well, if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the time between the 7th and the 10th plagues. It was like 8 weeks. And we know that based on the crops. The 7th plague is the plague of hail and what it destroyed. And then it said, and these other crops were, they weren't up yet. So they survived. Who knows? Months. I don't know. It could be years, yeah. 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 That's the best I can do. Although there are a few indicators about certain periods of time. Anything else? Yes. Right. Well, and they, as it says, they spoiled the Egyptians when they left. They took their stuff too. Yeah. Well, and that's just another manifestation of God's provision for them. They had plenty of evidence, didn't they? All right, guys. Thank you.